Okay, so that is the majority of part one of Thomson's article. Not everything, but some of the highlights of the arguments. I want to transition to part two now, but as I do that, let me note a kind of difficulty in the transition. If you've followed the logic, if you followed the logic of part one, hopefully you saw how the arguments work. But as there's this transition to part two, there can be not a particularly logical concern, but a kind of psychological concern. And I want to suggest this is true on both the part of conservatives and liberals, or at the very least people who already thought going into the argument that abortion may or may not be permissible for different reasons. I think that people who had already thought abortion is generally permissible might feel this kind of psychological feeling of saying to themselves, okay, good, now there's just another set of reasons for why abortion is okay. But that doesn't quite get at the issue, because the set of reasons didn't rely upon just the idea that a woman has a right to the use of her own body, or has a right over her own body. That was part of the concern in the first part. But it wasn't the only one, because the real concern had to do with what the nature of a right to life amounts to. And that it suggests that a right to life can be violated in certain circumstances if those circumstances are unjust. And so it goes past that kind of consideration. It also goes past this conservative thought. The conservative, or someone who thinks that abortion is generally impermissible, might have thought, well, I had already started off thinking that abortion was okay, or at least a necessary evil, in cases of rape anyway. But again, it matters what kinds of reasons we offer for that position, because it wasn't just based upon the woman not consenting or voluntarily engaging in sexual intercourse in cases of rape. It was deeper again. It was about the nature of rights. And so it's important. There are these kinds of psychological pitfalls that people can fall into where they say, oh, well, they agree with my position. But it matters that we agree with positions not for the wrong reasons, for the right reasons. We want to know what those reasons are, because we might find out, for example, that somebody agrees with our position for wildly different reasons than we think it's permissible or impermissible. So the right reasons matter. The right kind of arguments matter. So as we transition to part two, I'm saying this because usually when I teach this, all of the original intuitions that people have tend to come flooding back in when we get to part two. Why? Because part two is about cases beyond rape. Cases in which women have, to a greater or lesser degree, voluntarily engaged in sexual intercourse. And so Thomson wants to take this up in a couple of ways. The first is that she suggests this. The idea seems to be that there are basically two conditions. One, that she engaged in sexual intercourse voluntarily, which means it wasn't a case of rape. And we could expand that. It's not a case of other coercion. Because if someone is coerced in certain ways, we wouldn't want to call that a voluntary action. It would be involuntary. And the other is this, that the woman is knowledgeable about potential pregnancy by engaging in sexual intercourse. That's actually part of what makes it a voluntary action. And you might ask yourself, well, why do we even have to include the fact that she would have to be knowledgeable about a potential pregnancy? Isn't that obvious? And sometimes people say that, isn't that just obvious? But it's not. It's not obvious. You might think back to when you were 11 or 12 or 13 or 14 or 15. You might think back to the kinds of confusions that you may have had about the nature of sex in general. And it can be very common for both men and women, as they're going through puberty, to be very confused about the nature of sex and whether and how pregnancy could result. And so, in some cases, we might think of a case where a young man says to a young woman, well, you know you can't get pregnant the first time you have sex, which is utterly false. But here's the thing, she might believe that. She might be coerced into believing it, or she might just believe it because she likes the guy, or for whatever other reason. And who knows, he might believe that. He might not be knowledgeable either. But the point is this. It doesn't seem as though it's a voluntary action if the knowledge isn't there. And so there are lots of cases in which young women become pregnant without having any kind of knowledge that they might become pregnant. And now let me say one more thing about this. There's sometimes a certain kind of objection here, which is that, okay, there are cases in which people aren't knowledgeable, but they really should have been. And that's a nice thought. It's a compelling kind of thought. But the person who wants to suggest that abortion should be permissible in many cases can agree with that idea. They can say, well, we agree. We agree that maybe that person, the young person, should have known. But that's a kind of reason for a different kind of claim. What that reason supports is not that abortion should be impermissible in cases like this. What that supports is that we just need better sexual education so that we don't have these cases, these situations in which people engage in sex voluntarily to some degree, but not with the knowledge that it might result in pregnancy. And so there's a way of agreeing to that idea, but suggesting that it offers a reason for a different kind of conclusion. All right. So that's at least a couple reasons why she even suggests these two criteria, but she thinks that even these two criteria are not going to lead us necessarily to the permissibility or impermissibility in all cases. She thinks we have to take it somewhat case by case. Again, in cases outside of rape. And here's where she gives another set of ideas leading to a thought experiment, where there's this strange talk of burglars into a home and talk of people seeds floating in the air. Again, it's a strange idea. But here's why she's saying it. Both of these are supposed to be analogous, both the burglar and the people seeds, to a potential fetus. And she goes through a series of thoughts. Well, just because a woman will open her windows, that is, sometimes engage in sex, it doesn't mean that she's somehow inviting in a burglar. Just because she knows that, again, following both the voluntary and the knowledge claim, just because she knows that there are sometimes burglars lurking in neighborhoods. Or likewise, it wouldn't seem obvious that just because a woman voluntarily and knowledgeably opens a window, and yet has bars on the window, that she is inviting someone in. That she's giving them the permission to come into their house and stay there or steal. Or especially if, and this is the people seed idea, she not only has bars on her windows, but she has mesh nets, very fine, which are intended to keep people seeds out from entering the home that is her body. And so part of her intuition here is that even with a voluntary act, and even a knowledgeable voluntary act, it doesn't seem as though those two conditions by themselves, apart from the other factors in the consideration, are enough to suggest that abortion should be impermissible. That women voluntarily and knowledgeably engage in sex, and yet take precaution against having a child, knowing full well that in cases of contraception, there might be very small percentages in which there are failure rates. And there's another thought here. Again, there's a kind of superficial thought that is the opposing idea. the opposing idea is, well, people should take responsibility for their actions. Part of taking responsibility for their actions is accepting the consequences of those actions. But in going through this kind of case, by talking about bars on windows and mesh nets and so on, what I think Thomson is pointing to is the idea that that just is taking responsibility for one's actions. Because we might suggest, if we take a person who voluntarily and knowledgeably engages in sex, but does so without any protection or contraception whatsoever, versus a person who goes to great lengths, who makes it a number one priority or concern to engage in safe sexual practices. But her intuition here, I suspect, is that it's that second person who's acting more responsibly than the person who just doesn't engage in any kind of safe sex whatsoever. And so, again, the responsibility concern is a good one, the one that people should take responsibility for their actions. But her pointing to uses of contraception here seems to be a case in which people are taking responsibility, despite knowing that there are these failure rates occasionally. So, okay, so that is the bulk of the article, but there are a few more quick ideas. First, Thomson is not suggesting that all abortions are permissible. She thinks that some are either impermissible or at the very least they would be morally indecent, she says. And this might not coalesce with some of the views of people who already thought that abortion was or is or should be permissible. Maybe there are people who think that any and all of them should be. But she thinks it would be morally indecent, for example, if the violinist, for example, to take the original case, only had to be hooked up to you for an hour. It would be indecent not to allow that person 1 hour of your time in order to save his or her life. And so, likewise, on the other end of the spectrum, it would be morally indecent to suggest that a woman should be able to have any and all abortions just for the sake of convenience or for the sake of going on a trip that she had planned, or very late, for example, third trimester, perhaps, or even later, or near the end of the pregnancy. She thinks that these cases, it would be morally indecent, that there's some kind of minimal, at some point she says, good Samaritanism, that would require people to give others the use of their bodies, even if they were never permitted to in the first place. And so this article from Thomson is a kind of landmark article in discussing abortion for the reason that it gets by the initial assumption that there can be no agreement about whether the thing in question, the fetus, really is or is not a person. She doesn't believe it. She reminds us at the end of the article she doesn't believe that a fetus is really a person, but she grants the idea that it is, and then tries to argue that despite the fact that a fetus is a person, abortion is still permissible, both in cases of rape and in cases outside of the context of the horrific and tragic cases of rape. And so you might ask yourselves different kinds of questions. Do you agree? With her arguments? Do you have objections to her arguments? Do you have questions or concerns about her argument from any direction? And if so, what kinds of rational or other considerations could one bring to bear to suggest that Thomson is either correct or incorrect in her assessment of the permissibility and impermissibility of abortion?